Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. In our last episode, we had the Queen attending the funeral of her father. We had the English people dealing with the dreaded doodlebug, and we got a look at Prince Philip as he slowly made his way into the royal family. So let's see what's happening today. The Queen, at the end of 1944, began an association which gave her and others the pleasure for the rest of her life. She became a bencher at the Middle Temple, one of the four Inns of Court, the professional associations to which every English barrister must belong. Since the foundation of the Inns in the Middle Ages, no monarch or consort had ever joined any of them, and no woman had ever been a member of the Parliament of an Inn. The Middle Temple had been badly damaged by bombing, as had other historical buildings in London. The Queen's installation took place on December the 12th, 1944, in the new Parliament chamber, whose windows had been blown out. There was good cheer, though. The tables were set in the form of an E and were laid with the Middle Temple silver, which, like the contents of the wine cellar, had survived. There was a simple menu: clear soup, roast turkey, apple tart, and cheese and biscuits. For the rest of her life, the Queen rarely missed the annual dinner at the inn. The princesses did a pantomime called The Old Mother Red Riding Boots and performed it just before Christmas in Waterloo Chamber. The king thought it was better than ever, and the princesses did their parts very well and enjoyed them. This year, on his Christmas broadcast, he didn't have Logue as a speech therapist with him. The king knew that he didn't need his help. The Queen was dismayed by the way the press and the BBC appeared to support the communist side in Greece. The Queen wrote to Queen Mary that the press and intellectuals of the Socialist Party could be so blind as to back up a gang of bandits who wanted to seize power by force. We have suffered so much in the fight for what is called freedom. It was very sad that at this moment people could be misled as to what freedom means. It certainly doesn't mean government by Tommy gun. By 1945, the Queen was able to spend more time writing and seeing her friends, but she found the letters difficult because all she could write about was the war. April the 12th, 1945, the King and Queen were shocked to hear about the death of President Roosevelt from a cerebral hemorrhage. Queen Mary called it a positive catastrophe. The king said the news had been a great shock to him and that they would feel his loss very much. Roosevelt was succeeded by the little-known vice president, Harry Truman. The war by this time was nearly won. London was liberated, and the Doodlebug launch site across the channel had been captured or destroyed from the air, and the mobile launchers of the V-2 rocket bombs were rendered ineffective. Mussolini was seized by Italian partisans on April 27th and executed the next day. 2 days later, Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. Victory was finally announced on May 8, 1945. In his diary, the king wrote, "The day we've been longing for has arrived at last, and we can look back with thankfulness to God that our tribulation is over." The king gave his victory speech, and it was broadcasted by the BBC and relayed by loudspeakers around Whitehall that evening. It was a short speech, and he ended with the words, "The evildoers lie prostrate before us." The crowds on the street gasped at this phrase. "Advance Britannia," the Prime Minister shouted. The streets of every town in the country were filled with singing, dancing, frolicking people. Tens of thousands of them gathered in the mall in front of Buckingham Palace. The palace balcony had been surveyed to make sure it was still structurally sound after the bombs that had exploded nearby. That evening, the king, the queen, and the princesses appeared in the balcony for the first time together. Huge happy crowds roared for the family to come back out again and again. The princesses begged their parents to allow them into the crowds to celebrate. The king agreed. "Poor darlings, they have never had any fun yet," he wrote in his diary. With a party of young officers, the princesses danced through the city unrecognized as hundreds and thousands of people cheered and cheered their parents. The king was exhausted, and in his victory broadcast he stumbled over his words more than usual. Like the millions of his subjects, he was feeling the strain of the war. He looked shattered. He and the Queen found all the expressions of gratitude and praise for them overwhelming. They were especially moved by the tribute Churchill paid them. The Queen summed up her own feelings in a letter to Osbert Sitwell. "I feel rather numb by the emotions of last weeks, and on top of all the great anxieties of the last years, this has made me feel stunned as well, so you will understand a rather stupid letter, I hope. It is almost impossible to believe that the dreadful war is over and Germany is truly beaten. The sense of relief from bombs and rockets is very agreeable at the moment, and I hope that people won't forget too soon. They have shown such a noble and unselfish spirit all through the country during these long years of war, and I long for them to keep the same high level in the days to come. Our people respond so magnificently when they are asked to do hard things, to die, to smile amongst the wreckage of their homes, to work until they crack, to thank their neighbors before themselves. And the more difficult things you ask of them, the more response you get. It's been so wonderful, and all that spirit will be needed now, and now more than ever, for the whole world looks, even if it's some unwillingly, to these islands for leadership in decent living and thinking. We must do it somehow. So now we're going to enter into the peace between the years of 1945 to 1947. When the war ended, everyone found out about the horrors of Beslan, Buchenwald, and Auschwitz, and it was the war against evil and a new dark age, according to Churchill. Now that the war was won, the cost became clear. In Europe alone, more than 14 million people had died. The economic structure of the continent had been ruined, and millions of survivors became refugees wandering all over Europe. The Queen felt it hard to believe that the Germans could have been responsible for so much misery. The Queen wrote to Queen Mary that she and the King had aged a lot and looked rather haggard and ravaged, and one's clothes are so awful. The Queen at this time was in her mid-40s, and more mature and more matronly figure than when the war began. Both she and the King had expended enormous physical, mental, and emotional resources in the previous 5 years. The King, who had always had poor health, was exhausted by the physical and moral strain, and he knew it wasn't over yet. He said, "I have found it difficult to rejoice or to relax as there is still much hard work ahead to deal with," he wrote in his diary 10 days after VE Day. "Russia and America and the UK have got to work together to put Europe straight again after this upheaval." The King needed to rest, but he could not. From the Queen's point of view, the story of the next 6 years was of tumultuous change in the British society and of catastrophic decline in the King's health. At the end of the war, London was a drab and filthy city, with thousands of homes, churches, and other public buildings bombed beyond repair. The dust from the myriad bomb sites blowing everywhere. Buckingham Palace wasn't destroyed, but it would take years to repair the damage and restore both the palace and Windsor Castle to their pre-war state. Through the summer of 1945, the King and Queen tried to construct a normal family life around their daughters. They both knew that the war had made them public figures, and they had no chance of returning to a secluded private life. They went on victory tours in many different parts of the United Kingdom. They attended many march past and rallies or services to celebrate the achievements of many different groups, regiments, and associations. They visited the Channel Islands, the only part of the British Crown territory occupied by the Germans. The Queen was impressed by the spirit of the islanders. As a result of the visit, she decided to make a special gift to the islands to commemorate their loyalty and Christian spirit. It took the form of a specially made church plate, crucifix, and candlesticks for the two main churches in Jersey and Guernsey. Letters of praise and relief flooded into Buckingham Palace. The King wrote Cosmo Lang to say that he and the Queen had been overwhelmed by everyone's great kindness. "We have tried to do our duty in these 5 long, exacting years." The people were tired of war and wanted political change. Politics had been suspended since 1940, and the Labour leader, Clement Attlee, served loyally as Churchill's deputy in the coalition government. He wanted to prolong the coalition until the war with Japan was won, but the Labour Party decided at its annual conference in May 1945 to end the coalition at once. Queen Mary thought it was disgusting and ungrateful after all Churchill had done. The King and the Queen thought that, along with the millions of others that, because of Britain's heroic stand, they should still be considered a great power in 1945. The war, though, had vastly strengthened others, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union. Britain, in defeating the Nazis, had exhausted their gold and dollar reserves and worn out their industrial base, and had become dependent on American munitions, shipping, and foodstuffs. Each of these were essential to the war effort. Parliament was dissolved on June 15th. Polling began on July 5th, but instead of the usual 1 day, it was extended for much longer to enable the troops stationed overseas to vote. It was a stunning victory for the Labour Party, with a majority of 146, and the rejection of Churchill and the Conservatives announced on July 26th. The King and Queen were disappointed. Churchill that evening went to the palace to give his resignation. The King wrote in a diary a very sad meeting. He told Churchill he thought the people were very ungrateful. The King wrote Churchill he was sad that he was no longer his prime minister. He said that Churchill's breadth of vision and his grasp of the essential things were a great comfort to him in the dark days of the war. He said he would miss his consul more than he could say, and he hoped that they could get together at intervals as friends. Churchill answered him with a similar emotion. The Queen wrote to Queen Mary that the election had been a shock, and she felt that Bertie had thought Winston had been a great support and comfort through the terrible years of wars. She felt that Churchill was a great man with great vision, and his leadership had meant so much to so many. She said that people's memories were short, and now was the time to build up a good, sound government. She thought the timing was wrong, and she said with the Great War raging and a Potsdam Conference sitting there, it wasn't the time to have a change in government. The Queen said that her and the King were both tired. Queen Elizabeth said to Queen Mary, "You have been through all these things, Mama, and understand it all so well. It is hell, isn't it?" Churchill was devastated and philosophical. He felt that his knowledge and experience that he had gathered, the authority and goodwill that he had gained in so many countries, would vanish. When Churchill's doctor spoke of the ingratitude of the British people, Churchill said, "I wouldn't call it that. They have had a very hard time." To another aide, he said they were perfectly entitled to vote as they please. This is democracy. This is what we've been fighting for. August 1945, President Truman unexpectedly, and as he would later acknowledge, unwisely cut the economic lifeline of the Lend-Lease. The sudden end of the vital support meant that Britain had to negotiate new loans from the United States. The terms were burdensome. There was even less money to pay both imperial and post-imperial commitments, and the socialist revolution which the Labour Party had been elected to carry out. The government had to immediately cut imports of food, tobacco, textiles, fuel. Historian Robert Rhodes James said in his biography, The King, "A series of economic miseries that were to demoralize and eventually to destroy the post-war Labour government had begun." August the 6th, the first atom bomb was dropped on Japan, with the second following 3 days later. Unconditional surrender followed swiftly, and on August 15th, the Pacific War was finally over too. The King made a radio broadcast that night in which he said, "The war is over." He said, "Our hearts are overflowing, as are the people's." He stated that there is not one of us who has experienced this terrible war who does not realize that we shall feel its inevitable consequences long after we have all forgotten our rejoicings of today. The end of August, they went to Balmoral exhausted. It was a happy time, and they spent a month there and had a busy week in Edinburgh. With the princesses, they stayed at Holyrood House and attended Scotland's Victory Parade. The family remained in Scotland for the autumn, and it was a vital break for the King, but he still felt drained. The Queen always worried about the King's health. Duty pursued the King to Royal Lodge, Sandringham, or Balmoral. Every day he had to read state papers, cabinet minutes, and other documents that required a signature. He would stay up too late and smoke too much. At Balmoral, he had to spend as much time every day with his secretaries as in London. He found that no medicine, not even Dr. Wyer's powders, did him much good. The only cure was being out in the open air. So I'm going to end the video here, and the greatest thing that happened in this episode was the ending of the war. It had been going on so long, and the Queen had written she could hardly believe that the war was over and that Germany finally had been stopped. Churchill lost his Conservative Party vote and had to resign, which shocked the King and the Queen and made Queen Mary angry. Churchill was kind enough to say that it was what democracy was all about, and it was the people's choice. So once more, I created a list of merchandise from Amazon that I thought you might be interested in, and if you click on the link, it takes you to the Amazon page, and if you purchase it, I get a small commission that is of no extra cost to you. So I thought I'd mention that. That's in the description part of the video. And I want to thank all of you for subscribing to the channel and for all the kind comments as well as the thumbs up. It helps me to keep the channel growing and growing. And I wish everyone a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of the Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you.